I'm primarily a laboratory scientist, and I've done lots of research looking at how people respond to variations in virtual environments. But in virtual environments, unless you want it to rain, it doesn't rain, the wind doesn't blow, there aren't crowds of people, there aren't unexpected events on every occasion, every walk. This was really something else. But I think that you'll see that we got some really interesting data from the experiment. So I thought what I'd do is walk you through, first of all, the methodology. So the basic idea was that on a weekly basis over the course of the lab, we invited people to go for walks through this neighborhood, and we had a series of stopping places. And at those stopping places, we tried to test people's feelings, their emotions, their levels of arousal, and to some extent as well, their physiology. So we used BlackBerries for part of the procedure, handheld devices that were specially programmed to allow us to administer a variety of different kinds of psychological tests to people as they walked along the walk. We also tried to assess the state of their bodies using sensors, and I'll show you a little bit of detail about how the sensors work in just a second. And we also tried to elicit their verbal reactions to the places that they'd seen. And all I mean by that is that at each of the stopping places, we asked people to give us words that they felt characterized the things that they were seeing, that they felt characterized how they saw the spaces being used. And I'll show you in a bit some word clouds that relate to each of the stopping points on the walk. A lot of the BlackBerry tasks were based on self-assessment. So as people walked along, they saw these what are called self-assessment mannequins, and they were asked to self-assess their own emotional or affective state, and that's the upper row of mannequins, and also their level of arousal, and that's the lower level of the lower row of mannequins. And the idea basically was for them to select the mannequin that they thought most closely matched their current state. We also had an attention task. This is a laboratory task called the Sustained Attention to Response task. It's a horrible task. I think anybody who did it on the walk would agree with me that it is a horrible task. It's a test of your ability to be vigilant, to maintain attention to something that's happening on the BlackBerry. And if this link works, I'll be able to give you a little bit of a taste of what the Sustained Attention to Response task looks like. Okay, so this is the Sustained Attention to Response task, and as you can see, there's just a series of single digits flashing one at a time, and the task of the participants was to watch that display. The digits appear about once per second, and to press a button on the BlackBerry every time a digit appeared, except for the digit 3. And so you can actually try this for yourself if you want. You could tap on your knee or something like that. Just try tapping once every time you see a digit, but don't tap when you see a 3. When you describe the task to people, it seems deceptively easy, but when you actually try to do the task, you find that it's really quite difficult. And people in our experiment did reasonably well, but there was a bit of variation from site to site, as I'll show you. Now we were also recording people's physiology. We were doing that using some specially designed cuffs. You can see here that this is really a nice, unobtrusive device. You wear it like a wristwatch. And on the back side of that cuff, as you can see, there are a couple of sensors. And those sensors are measuring the state of your sweat glands. They basically are passing a very small charge from one sensor to the other at a rate of 2 times per second. And the ability of your skin to conduct electricity is a measurement of the state of your underlying sweat glands. So people were wearing these cuffs from the beginning of the walk through to the end of the walk. So we had continuous information about their levels of arousal while they took the walk with us. Now here's the route. So this is obviously an overhead map to orient you. If you look to the very top of the map, that's our approximate location right now, and the the participants were led on a walk to a series of different sites along East Houston Street. This is the first stopping point. This is a stopping point in front of the Whole Foods building on East Houston, just over in this direction. So that's stopping point 1. So now at this stopping point, everybody would be directed to line up along the sidewalk, to all look basically in the same direction, and to do the BlackBerry tasks, and then to move on to stopping point number 2, which is this one. This is a sidewalk near a restaurant called Macondo, which is over in this direction on East Houston. And from there to a lush urban green space called the Mafinda Kalunga Community Garden. And from there to a restaurant called the Pete's Restaurant. From there to a sidewalk in front of a social housing building on Eldridge Street. And from there to the middle of a median on Allen Street. So at each of those stops, people were asked to do the BlackBerry tasks, and for the whole walk, people were wearing these cuffs. So these sites weren't chosen at random. We had particular reasons for choosing the stopping points that we did. And in particular, there were a couple of contrasts that we were interested in looking at. And one of them was the contrast of the Whole Foods stopping point and the stopping point in front of Macondo. The urbanist Jan Gehl has talked about the influence of different kinds of building facades on our behavior. So the Macondo stopping point, in his terminology, would be called an A facade. And what he means by that is that it's a facade with lots of activity, lots of things to see inside the facade, lots of entrances and exits, people going in and out, and activities. As opposed to an E facade, which is long, continuous, not much to look at, and not much activity, no entrances, no displays. And in Gehl's work, what he's shown, he's actually done some behavioral sampling where he's shown that when people walk past these two different kinds of facades, they do different kinds of things. So for example, walking past an A facade, you're much more likely to make head turns as you walk, which makes sense. There's much more for you to look at. And you're much, much more likely to stop in front of an A facade as compared to an E facade. So we wanted to see whether those same kinds of differences in facades produce differences in how people felt when standing at locations of E and A facades, and to see whether those differences were manifest in their physiology as well. There was another explicit contrast that we wanted to make, and that was between people's feelings and behavior in front of the Pete's Restaurant and in front of the social housing building. Now, these two stops were directly side by side on Eldridge Street. The scaling was approximately the same for both of the buildings, but there were some differences that we thought might be key and interesting to look at. For one thing, the facade in the case of the Pete's was quite varied in texture, and varied in color, had some nice planters, and the social housing stop had very uniform texture and color and really very little vegetation. What I've called here the park is the Mafinda Kalunga Garden. We chose the garden because there is a vast literature in environmental psychology on the influence of green space on one's feelings and one's physiology. And so we wanted to have that as kind of a benchmark to test the effects of immersion in urban green space on our participants. And the Allen Street medium for us was a little bit of a flyer. It's kind of an ambiguous space. I know that there are some plans underway for thinking about redevelopment of that space. And it has some interesting features that we wanted to look at to compare with all of the other stopping points. So at the conclusion of each of the walks, there was a debriefing session held by Alex and Andreas, and they'll be talking to you, I think, a little bit later on in this presentation. And at that debriefing session, we showed participants some of the results from the BlackBerry tasks, and we showed them in the form of the nefarious heat maps. And this is an example of one heat map. Basically, what this shows you is a map of the stopping points on a walk with colors that reflect people's performance on the different tasks in the experiment. So the variation in color here reflects, in this case, variations in mood or emotion at different stopping points. But I'll show you the data in a different and somewhat more transparent form in just a second. This is just to show you that this is the kind of data that people had access to at the conclusion of the walk. And we also got lots of commentary and suggestions and discussion from them about the stopping points. I'll just quickly fly through the word maps. These are word maps that we constructed based on the verbal reactions that people had at the stopping points. This is Whole Foods, and you can see that the words that light up are words like moving, space, bland, narrow. This is Macondo. So remember, this is one of the contrasts we wanted to make. And here we see things like eating, lively, mixed, busy, open. This is the garden. Words like oasis, green, open, and peaceful, and garden lit up strongly. A Pete's was a little bit more ambiguous, but if you scan through the words, you'll see that most of them are kind of friendly and positive words. This is the social housing stop, and you can see the words that light up are obviously housing, and also the word oppressive, dilapidated, bunker, disrepair, unfriendly, boring, monotonous. And this is the Allen Street median, where one word lit up very strongly, and that was the word busy. Now I'll show you some data that shows comparisons of people's scores at different stopping points. This is for comparison of affect at the stopping points. And the first bar shows baseline, so high values here are positive affect. You can see that the stopping points after baseline that lit up most strongly for positive affect were the garden, which was not really a surprise to us, and the Allen Street median stop, which was somewhat of a surprise.
Can you tell us what affect is?
Sure. So by affect, I mean just people's emotion, either positive or negative. So the higher the number, the more positive emotion, the happier people felt that they were at the stopping points. This is a graph showing people's self-assessed arousal at the stopping points, and you can see again that the highest point for arousal was the Allen Street median, and a Pete's was also quite high, and Macondo was high on the arousal scale as well. And you can see that there's a contrast between the Whole Foods stop and the Macondo stop. Remember, that's the different facade styles that we wanted to compare, and the arousal levels were higher for Macondo than they were for Whole Foods. And this is a graph that shows affect and arousal, and it shows that they were quite strongly correlated. So when people were asked to assess their own emotion or their own arousal state, they were generally correlated with one another, but not quite always. Interestingly enough, at the garden stop and at the housing stop, there was kind of a separation of values for emotion and for arousal. At the garden stop, emotions were very positive, and arousal was less so. And the reverse pattern is seen at the housing stop, where the emotional value was quite low, in fact, the lowest on our scale, and the arousal level was higher. I'll just show you the results on the attention task. The big surprise here, there's a great literature showing that people who are immersed in green spaces have some restoration of their ability to pay attention, to think. And so our prediction was that we would find the best performance on the attention task in the green space. And in fact, we found the opposite pattern. We found the worst performance on the attention task in the green space. People were making the most errors on that SART task, the attention task in the green space. And we think, this is post hoc, but we think what was happening here was that people were so fascinated by their immersion in the green space that they were unable to pay attention to a BlackBerry task. I'll show you this graph, which shows what happens to people when they cross East Houston Street. So the lines here, the colored lines, each of these represents the behavior, the arousal level of one person. And you can see that they generally soar as they're crossing East Houston. The image that I'm showing now is basically, as you can see, it's a satellite view of part of the walk with a contour overlaid on the satellite view. That contour represents the route, and the height of the contour represents the level of arousal. So as people begin the walk, now they're walking from left to right on this slide. You can see they're walking towards Whole Foods, and arousal levels are kind of low, and they start to rise a little bit as they approach the street corner. They walk back now from right to left on this slide, from Whole Foods to Macondo, and you can see again that there's kind of a bulge that happens as they approach that busy intersection, but then levels drop a little bit, but they're not dropping to as low a level as we saw at Whole Foods. Here's the walk to the park. So the walk now is from right to left on this slide, and you can see that there's a gradual decrease in levels of arousal until they arrive at the park, and the levels of arousal in the park space are the lowest physiological arousal levels that we saw on the entire walk. And that was quite consistent. And then this walk starts at the bottom left corner of the slide. This is leaving the park and then walking to, first of all, the restaurant and social housing stops. And those are the dip that you see in the middle of the slide. And then leaving those stops and heading towards the Allen Street median. And you can see that something interesting starts to happen as they walk away from those stops, the restaurant and social housing stops. Levels of arousal remain fairly low until they start to walk back towards Allen Street. And then this happens. There's a gigantic increase in arousal levels as people walk along the central median along Allen Street and eventually back to East Houston. And this is a map that shows the entire arousal map for the walk. So now if you look at the top left in the slide, you can see, it's hard to make out because the levels are kind of low, but you can see that initial walk in black towards the corner by Whole Foods, and then the larger blue contour represents the walk back over to Macondo, and then the central, the T-junction represents the turn down towards the green space, which is at the bottom of the slide, and then eventually the walk, the curve around to the stops, the social housing and the restaurant stops, and then eventually the stop back to Allen Street. And I think I'll stop there.
And we have about 15 minutes left. And I wanted to open it up for questions, but I realized the two people who are more familiar with our experimentation and the experience of moving through these spaces than anyone are the two interns who have been running the tours and experiments. So I'd like to invite Alex Belinder-Gibson and Andres Carter to come up and offer for us any quick insights you might have from those experiences.
Let's move over here. Okay, so my name is Andres Carter. This is Alex. We're going to touch upon 4 points very quickly. The first one is the value of the survey. So a lot of people who did the survey had recorded their impressions, thought that it could serve as a personal tool for evaluating the spaces that they went to, but actually just generally for any space, let's say that's in their community or where they go to work or study. And they also felt like this could also be used by communities for community development.
Another thing that we found that was interesting and also very beneficial for everyone involved was that they're evaluating all different kinds of space, and that we're asking them to, participants to actually slow down and stop in spaces that normally you would just walk by and not pay any attention to it. And also the way you're rating your physical environment by looking at things objectively as well as subjectively.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think a lot of people tend to choose specific places to evaluate, maybe monuments or famous places. They don't typically tend to choose just random locations that are on their routes. And so I think that the survey helped them think a little bit differently. Also, there was a little bit of confusion. This is actually a good confusion with the first question, or the impression that actually the third one that they're asked to record, which is their personal perspective of each of the sites, or how they would use the space. So the way that it was phrased was, what would you do here? And we're actually asking them to imagine themselves in that location, how they could use that public space. In fact, most people were thinking of this as a call to an intervention, like what they would actually do to change the space. So after talking to many groups, we realized that there is quite a desire to actually do something in those spaces, and that's why Kaya's workshop was so valuable as well.
I think one of the things that we definitely recognized the most out of everyone that participated was this common belief that after they had gone through with the experiment and been a part of it and participated, that when they leave, when they walk around, even throughout the day and like next days and whatever, they're actually paying more attention, closely observing their environments whenever they're in the city. So that was really nice to know.